Hello and welcome to End of Life University Seminar Series. This is your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and I'm so glad you've decided to join us today for another one of these very important interviews as we look into all aspects of the end of life. And today my very special guest is Reverend Terri Daniel. Terri Daniel is an ordained interfaith minister, clinical chaplain, and intuitive counselor who assists dying and grieving individuals to discover a more spiritually spacious understanding of death and beyond. She is an in-demand teacher, speaker, and workshop presenter for conferences and symposiums worldwide. Terri's unique perspective on birth, death, and the journey of the soul helps the dying and the bereaved find meaning and healing through meditative and ritual practices that open a conduit to other dimensions. Her unique form of radical mysticism incorporates elements of Buddhism, shamanism, ancient pagan practices, Gnostic Christianity, and other spiritual traditions to break down limiting beliefs about forgiveness, judgment, and negative experience. Terri replaces these beliefs with an empowering vision of a co-created universe where there are no victims or perpetrators, only souls seeking expansion and awareness. After the death of her 16-year-old son in 2006 and the eloquent after-death communications she received from him, Terri immersed herself in metaphysical studies and meditation practices to help her fine-tune her intuitive abilities. At the same time, she became a hospice volunteer and trained as a transition guide for helping the dying cross over. At age 56, she went back to school to pursue degrees in theology and pastoral care and began working in hospital and hospice chaplaincy. In 2010, Terri founded the Afterlife Education Foundation and its annual conference, which features the world's leading researchers, counselors, and educators in the metaphysics of death, dying, and bereavement. In addition to writing, teaching, and chaplaincy work, she recently launched a new service that provides end-of-life spiritual care to animals and their families that are facing life-threatening diagnoses or critical injuries. Terri is the author of 3 books on death and the afterlife: A Swan in Heaven, Conversations Between Two Worlds; Embracing Death, A New Look at Grief, Gratitude, and God; and her newly released book, Turning the Corner on Grief Street, Loss and Trauma as a Journey to Awakening. Terri, I am so happy that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today and to share in a conversation with me. So welcome to End of Life University.
Thank you so much, Karen. And listening to you give that introduction of me, it makes me tired just listening to, did I really do all those things?
You've been extremely busy.
I have indeed. And it's kind of nice to listen to it through somebody else's perspective, and think, wow, I really am doing something important, I mean, not to brag on myself, but it made me feel good to hear that. Thank you.
Well, it's clear that you're really on a mission. I mean, you are really on your path doing your life's work, it sounds to me, from everything that has happened to you. And I know your bio touched on it briefly, but I was hoping you'd just tell our readers a little bit about how you first got interested in end-of-life care.
Sure, of course. I have always been intuitive. I was a little intuitive child, and I've always been metaphysically minded as I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and was interested in Buddhism when I was 14, so I always kind of had a spiritual leaning. And fast forward to my 40s, early 40s, and my son, at 10 years old, was diagnosed with a rare metabolic disorder called metachromatic leukodystrophy that pediatricians maybe heard about it in medical school, but generally don't know what it is unless they are neurologists. And it's a rare white matter myelin disintegration kind of disease, and he was given 5 to 10 years to live. And I was told that he would be degenerating over time, which he did, and he went from being a perfectly normal little 7-year-old to needing total care at the end of the end of his life. He couldn't speak, he couldn't walk, he couldn't manage his body in any way. And when I got that diagnosis, of course I felt grief and pain. I'm human. But I also went somewhere else, and it was like, what does this mean? Why is this happening? Not like many people do, like, oh, God, why me? But it was more a kind of curiosity as to, why would this come into my path, into our path? And what are we supposed to do with this? And I always looked at it that way from day one. So as the years went by, and he, began to get sicker and sicker, eventually, in the last couple of years, he lost the ability to speak. And as he was losing speech, I was increasing my intuitive and psychic abilities. And, of course, we began communicating telepathically, which is not unusual with a mother and child because we do it with babies, right? They can't talk to us, and we know what they need most of the time. But at the same time, I was also doing tarot readings at a metaphysical bookstore. And I met a woman there who became my mentor. She was a channeler, and she watched me do some readings, and she said, well, do you know that you're channeling when you do that? And I said, nah, I'm not a channeler. I don't know how to do that. And she said, everybody knows how to do that. You just have to trust what you are receiving. And so I began working with her, and she basically taught me how to trust that there is an open conduit to higher guidance, and that I can listen to the messages that are coming through that conduit. And so I started doing that right around the time my son stopped talking. And I realized later that it was so that we could practice this interdimensional conversation that we've had going ever since he died. And 30 minutes after he died, I was lying on the bed with him, holding his body in my arms, and I said, where are you? Can you show me a picture of where you are right now? And that's how it started. It's just the floodgates opened, and I started getting images and pictures and words, and fast forward to now, he's been the man behind the curtain all this time and has essentially been teaching and doing this work with me.
Wow. So you have an incredible partner on the other side, your coworker, and now it suddenly makes sense that his illness was really preparing you for all of this work that the two of you would be doing together.
It makes so much sense. And, this is part of what I teach when I'm working with people who are grieving, is to try to help them look for that story, that what I like to call pattern of perfection. There are patterns of perfection in every traumatic experience. But in order to see those patterns, you have to be willing to step back and take a more metaphysical, non-dualistic look at human experience. And in order to look at it that way, many people have to go through a crisis of faith and completely shake all their beliefs and attachments to see it another way. Some people can do it, some people can't.
I love that. In my book, What Really Matters, that's one of the things I've talked about, is that we have to be able to take the galaxy view of our lives. We have to be able to look down on our life from as far away as the galaxy and perceive our life in the bigger picture. So I love it that that's what you're talking about too, is we can look at life from the details as we're experiencing it moment to moment, or we can step away or rise above it and see the bigger picture and how it fits into the entire universe in a sense.
Yes, it's the view from space. I love your term galaxy view. That's a good way to put it. I received an image that explains that in a channeled message from my son, which he said, it's like the pieces in a kaleidoscope. So if you look at kaleidoscope, every piece appears to be separate and is kind of separate, but they can't move independently. Everything one piece does, all the other pieces follow. And so every event in the universe, this is how I usually say it, like, how you've heard a butterfly lands on a flower and everything changes. It's like that. And in a bigger piece, there's an earthquake in Haiti, there's a tsunami in Japan, whatever, there's a Holocaust in Europe, kid gets hit by a car, tree falls on your house, whatever it is, it's a turn of the kaleidoscope. And when that turn happens, everything breaks apart and realigns in a different form because we are interconnected. When an earthquake happens in Haiti, the people in Haiti are connected to us like the piece in the kaleidoscope right next to us, little triangular pieces of glass or whatever they're made of. And so everything moves together. And when you can see that movement, which is really the oneness that spiritual teachers have been talking about forever, when you can see that we're part of that movement, it's not about our little individual drama, because there's no separation between anything, between us and anything else.
That's such profound wisdom and also just beautiful imagery, and I really like applying it right now where we are in history at this moment in time, because we are at a falling apart place where our pictures and our images are all falling apart, and so people are feeling a lot of despair and a lot of anxiety about that, but partly because they don't understand that a new, even more beautiful picture is forming as we reconnect. And that's a beautiful imagery. I love that idea of the kaleidoscope.
Yes, and it happens. It's not that we're at a falling apart place now. We've always been at a falling apart place. Falling apart is part of the endless circle of life, and most religious traditions have some sort of circle icon. Mm-hmm. There's the Hindu wheel of life, there's the Native American sacred hoop, there's Celtic circles. That's just as ancient and natural as it can be. And it's because consciousness and existed, it's not linear. It's not a straight line from point A to point B. It's circular. So all of those falling apart points are happening all the time. You can look at any point in human history and say, we were at a falling apart point. Our reality was getting challenged. It happens everywhere, every day, and that's what's supposed to happen. And we're actually having a conversation right now. I have a Facebook group related to my work and to the Afterlife Conference, and we're having a discussion there right now about how annoying a lot of us find the concept of positive thinking. That sounds terrible,
yes.
But it's kind of like it's where does somebody get the idea that we're supposed to have a conflict-free existence? If you think positive thoughts, nothing bad will ever happen to you. Mm-hmm. If you think that you will manifest health and love and wealth and whatever, because your thoughts create your experience, then there's no reason why you can't have those things, because we're meant to be happy. And the book and the movie The Secret really nailed that down, and it's something I disagree with hugely because we can't have a conflict-free. Yeah, I figured you probably did. Go on the Facebook page. You'll see quite a delightful little conversation about this right now. Yes, you know what I mean. So, suffering is important. If we didn't have suffering, we would never stretch. When you sit in a chair in a weird position and you get a cramp in your leg, you change your position. That's what suffering is for. That's what the cramp in your leg is for, to tell you something's wrong, shift your weight to the other leg. And if we didn't have that, we'd never shift and we'd be paralyzed. We'd be sitting there with that cramp until our circulation stopped and we'd fall over.
And you only have to spend a little bit of time in nature to recognize everything dies. Everything has its own life cycle, and death is part of it. And so is suffering in a sense. And then why would man be any different than all the rest of life that we see around us and before us? Why would it be any different for us? That of course it's meant to be part of our existence. I agree with you completely.
Yeah, we're really no different than an amoeba or a piece of celery. We have the same life cycle, at least the bodies. On a soul level, maybe our soul is different than the soul of an amoeba because we're having a different kind of experience. But on the physical level, just in terms of physical death and the cycles of bodies, there's no difference at all. And on the soul level, there's no difference at all either. I mean, we're all in the cosmic soup together. And I don't know what the soul of an amoeba is doing here on Earth, but I'm sure it has an intention of some sort.
I'm sure. Well, I have to agree with you totally because I've been feeling for a long time that one of the problems of this kind of new age spirituality is that it has led us down this path of positivity and people have in some cases not been able to learn from their suffering or to learn how to just cope with the day-to-day existence of life and the day-to-day difficulties of life because they keep expecting that they should be happy and everything should be working out okay for them. And so we're kind of missing the point entirely by seeking always for happiness instead of embracing life just as it is with everything that it brings us, the full spectrum.
Yes, somebody said that in the Facebook discussion today that, we're a society addicted to happiness. And if you read Pema Chodron, the Buddhist nun and author, her books are so wonderful, she says that we're constantly leaning away from discomfort. Nobody likes discomfort. When you put your hand in a fire, you yank it back. And that's our instinct for anything that isn't comfortable. When in fact, if we can lean into the pain, which is a very Buddhist concept, on the other side of it, the whole world changes. We just go with the flow of the kaleidoscope turning instead of trying to, stick a wrench in the works and stop it from turning. Because that's really what we're doing by avoiding our pain.
And in fact, we are actually causing ourselves even more pain and discomfort in a way by resisting it than if we were to go with the flow. We would, as you were describing, we would find the perfect pattern within whatever is happening in our lives, and we would find our place of comfort within it, even though it isn't all positive or happy.
But we would find something. Something would come of it. And because we're meant to change. Nothing in the universe is stagnant and just sits still exactly the same all the time. So if you look at the life cycle of a grieving person, there's a lot of things they can do with that. And I work with a lot of bereaved parents because when I first started out with my first book, I had a child die, and so I figured, that's my audience. That's who I should talk to, is other people who've had children die. And I learned very quickly that most of them were not ready to hear my message. They were very attached to their pain and anger and seeking blame, and were not able to take that galactic view. So I very quickly pulled myself out of that marketplace, and that's why I started the conference, actually. That's how it all came about, is I wanted to have a gathering of people who could understand this on a different level. And it worked.
Well, I want to get into the conference in a minute, but I was hoping, since we've been on this subject of grief, you would talk a little bit about your books, because I have the sense that they're a very important contribution out there, and I'd like our listeners to hear about your writing too, and learn a little bit more about your books. So just tell us.
Sure, thank you. Well, the first book was pretty much dictated by my son. I started writing that about a month after he died because he was talking to me all the time, and it wasn't like hearing audio sound. It was like thoughts being impressed in my mind that I knew were not my own. Stuff was coming to me that I could have never thought up on my own, like the kaleidoscope idea. And I was just compelled to write it all down. I kept a journal. And then the journal became the first book, which begins on the day Danny died. That's the beginning of the book, and all about how we communicated, and it's biographical. It tells my story of what I did after that and our life together. And then the second book, Embracing Death, A New Look at Grief, Gratitude, and God, is more of the teachings that I was receiving at that point. Just it didn't have the autobiographical stuff as much as just what Danny was explaining to me about the journey of the soul and how everything works. And the third book, which just came out a couple weeks ago, is called Turning the Corner on Grief Street. And this has a pretty funny story behind it, and I guess I'll tell it. I have a very active Facebook group, as I mentioned, and one day I posted this thing. I had this revelation or this message that said, people can be stuck on Grief Street. If you picture it like a street and you're standing there on the sidewalk in a city, you can go to the corner and look around the corner, and off in the distance there's a whole other landscape that you can go to. Or you can go get in the elevator and take it to the top of the high-rise building and look at the view from the 52nd floor and see a different perspective. Or you can go down in the subway station and take the subway and look around in the subconscious. There's all these different views you can take instead of the one perspective that you get standing there with your feet in the cement on Grief Street. So I just posted this, little prose about that, and it started to get shared around Facebook, and it ended up on some of the grief group pages, and people went nuts. It was like an angry mob out to get me. It really, really offended people. And they said, I'm stuck on Grief Street, so what? I don't want to look around the corner. I just want my dead daughter to come back. People literally said things like that.
Wow.
And that's when I realized that there was a big problem with a lot of bereaved people, especially those who, and I mean specifically parents now, who are involved in some of these groups, and there's some national organizations for grieving parents, and they're not given tools to move forward. And I would never tell somebody that I want them to move out of their grief, but I would tell them that I want them to evolve with their grief and not stay in that same place. It's supposed to evolve. That's why we have stages of grief and stages of spiritual development. And so that's what the new book is about. And I expect it's probably going to be controversial for some people, and I even put a disclaimer in the front of it that said, this may not be suitable for the newly bereaved. If you're struggling with guilt and anger and blame, you probably don't want to buy this book. So,
wow, it sounds amazing, and I just have to tell you a little bit of my own personal story, because quite a number of years ago, my father committed suicide, and I was one of those people stuck in grief, but grief and guilt because his death was a suicide, also because I'm a doctor and because I'm trained to treat depression. And I'd treated several patients who were suicidal and helped them, and the idea that I couldn't help my father was so devastating to me. But ultimately, when I was able to heal my grief, I realized the problem was I got stuck in my grief because I didn't want to change. I didn't want my life to change, and I kept thinking things will go back to the way they were before. I'll feel like I used to feel. Life will look like it used to look. Just my dad won't be here, but I'll go back to where I was before. And what I ultimately realized is that was what made me stuck, that I wasn't allowing my grief to change me. I wasn't allowing my life to just change and, as you said, evolve with the grief. And it took me a long time to be able to see it and then also to move forward. And for me, getting involved in hospice work is one of the things that helped me finally move, finally allow my life to change.
Wow. That is a fantastic piece of self-awareness. That's just beautiful. And you really hit the nail on the head with that, that you wanted life to look like it did before, only without your father there. And I don't know, I can't even think of the word for how magical thinking that is, you know, and that is how people think. I want to feel like I felt before. I want my marriage to be like it was before. I want my days to be like they were before. It's just that my child won't be here. Well, that's impossible. You know, yet that, you're right, that is what people are hoping for. And it's really just a way of avoiding the pain of expansion, growing pains.
Yes, and it ultimately over time it's been so clear to me, you know, as you were describing, that this was just part of my path and my father's path and what was meant to be, and I got sent off in a brand new direction once I got involved in hospice work and working with the end of life, and it all became so clear. Oh yes, this was the transformation that was meant to happen. I just resisted it for a number of years and dragged my feet, and that's why it took me a while to get there.
And that's okay too. You get there whenever you get there. You know, there's no timetable. But now, looking at what you're doing in hospice work and the End of Life University, you can actually look at your father now and say thank you, which would have been unimaginable before.
Yes, in fact, when I wrote my book, What Really Matters, about my experiences with hospice patients, and when that book got published, I said, Dad, look what we did.
Yes.
Because my dad was my partner in all of this, and so suddenly, after all those years, there was the meaning that I had been looking for. You know, my dad's suicide felt so purposeless and so meaningless, and I couldn't understand, like, how did it make any sense whatsoever that his life ended in that way. But suddenly there was a meaning, and not that this was the only meaning of his life, but suddenly there was meaning to the entire experience and to everything that I went through over those years. And so just as you've experienced, it starts to make sense, and then you know that you're on the path you're supposed to be on.
Well, meaning is the gift. And even, you know, in basic grief counseling 101, we learn as counselors that the trick is to help somebody find meaning in the event. Now, not everybody can go on to write books and be a hospice doctor, you know, but in their own way, they can do all kinds of things. And that brings us to how much is missing in our society for dealing with death and loss. We don't even have the rituals. I can't tell you how many hospice families I've seen who, because they are not religious or they don't align with a religion, don't even have a memorial service. They just have nothing. And we have so much resistance to religion, which is completely well-founded, in my opinion, but in that we have lost our affinity for spirituality. And so people will say, well, I'm not going to have a funeral for my husband. We don't believe in that stuff. And they don't really know what they're talking about because, of course, they don't believe in, you know, the traditional heaven and hell and church stuff, but you still have to have rituals, and you make them fit with your beliefs. But sadly, because so many people have rejected traditional religion, they've rejected ritual. And without ritual, it becomes much harder to find that meaning that we need to heal.
That's so very true, and thus we have this great emptiness in our society when we do come to dealing with issues like the end of life, or even dealing with serious life-threatening illness. We're at a loss in some ways because we haven't carried over with us meaning and ritual to help us when we need it.
Yes, and that's what ritual is created for that very purpose. From the first human being who made a ritual of some sort was to help him get through something or understand something. So with no rituals, I mean, I can name 3 women right off the top of my head whose sons have died, who did nothing, no funeral, they couldn't, it was too painful. The sons, in one case, the friends of the son had a memorial service, but the mother wouldn't go because it was too upsetting and too painful. And it's kind of like I can't think of what to compare it with, but it's kind of like if you face something, the monsters aren't really there, you know, and for her to have gone to the memorial service and listened to his friends talk about how much they loved him and do whatever rituals they did would have helped her so much. You know, I keep wanting to say it's like ripping off a Band-Aid quickly, but it's not like that at all. It's about leaning into pain rather than pulling away from it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Facing up to whatever it is that life has handed us and embracing it and doing our best with that, whatever it is, we have to do our best and move through it.
And then if we're ready to really go into a deeper understanding, we can look at the agreements like you and your father had and still have. Mm-hmm. If we look at it from that galactic view, and in that view, and now we're sort of getting into the way the Course in Miracles describes it as there are no special relationships. You are not father and daughter. Danny and I are not mother and son. We're just two souls hanging out together. Mm-hmm. And if you bring in a belief in reincarnation into that mix, it makes even more sense that we've been hanging out together for a long time. And we're a creator team, and we're doing all kinds of adventures here in physical form. And this was just one of many. And even if you don't believe in reincarnation, you can still look, using your example, at your father's death as how did that change the shape or the look of the kaleidoscope? Mm-hmm. And how did that shift your whole family and everybody's view and everybody's direction, hopefully expanding their understanding? It would make them question their beliefs. If somebody believed suicide was a sin and the person goes to hell, that person might be very, very stuck in that belief, or this is an opportunity for them to question that belief. Mm-hmm. And start reading some different books and looking into some different theologies and finding comfort in what they find. The opportunity for expansion is always there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Always there in any situation, no matter what it is.
Yeah.
Well, I had a question for you that I wanted to ask you what you would do in this situation, because I know you're very comfortable talking about the afterlife. But just a couple of weeks ago, I was guest teaching at a college class on end-of-life issues, on death and dying. So for, a group of 20-something students in the class, and they wanted me to talk about death and dying from the medical perspective and from a doctor's perspective and what I saw as issues. And right before I was ready to speak, the instructor, one of the students said to the instructor, "How come we never talk about the afterlife in this class?" And the instructor said, "Because I don't believe in it, because the afterlife is something that people have made up to make them feel more comfortable with the idea that when you die, there's nothing there." And then I looked at her, and she saw me looking at her, and she said, "Now, of course, I'm not trying to say that you have to believe that just because I do, but, if you're one of those people who wants to believe something else, you're free to do that." And I was really upset because I thought she's the instructor of the class. She's in a position of authority, and so she is, in spite of what she's claiming, she is imposing her beliefs on these students. They're impressionable, and she's the person they've come to learn from, so she's telling them there's no afterlife. And I had such a strong reaction inside that I need to tell them differently, and I have to figure out how to do that without offending the teacher and then getting kicked out of the classroom and uninvited from ever guest teaching. But I was just curious about what you might do or say in a similar situation.
Well, but before I say what I would do or say, what did you do?
Well, what I did, and I'm a rather non-confrontational person, just to understand me. So I did my presentation, and then I started talking about my own mom died last year, and I started telling them about my mom's death, and I was with her in the room and caring for her, and there was a moment when her eyes rolled back in her head, and it was obvious to me that her soul left her body. Her body was still breathing and the heart was beating, but she was no longer there, and I was describing that as her soul leaving her body. And then I told them that a month or so after she died, I was on a radio show where the host was a psychic medium, and during the middle of the radio show, she started getting messages from my mom on the radio show. And so I started describing that to them. And I wanted to give them a real life experience from someone who's, I'm trained in science. I'm a doctor, but this is what happened in my life. And so I said, there are things that happen that we can't explain, and no one can explain it. And I looked at the teacher. As I said,
no, and not even the teacher. Now, what class was this?
It was a class on death and dying. It was
wow.
So anyway, that's what I did. I found my own way of getting the message across, and those students were hanging on every single word. They were so fascinated, and I realized they're just hungry. They're hungry for this, and they want to hear many different perspectives. They don't need a teacher with a narrow point of view who will just shut down their questions and their inquiry.
Well, what that teacher should have done is bring in, many guest teachers. I mean, if I was that teacher, I would bring a Hindu person in to talk about their death rituals and beliefs, and a Catholic to talk about what they think, and give the kids as much data as possible so that they can decide, and I don't know what other things that teacher did, but you did the right thing. I mean, you gave them something evidential. I think I would have probably been more opinionated than that. I would have probably said, well, from what I've seen in my experience with dying people, the people who believe there's absolutely nothing, and I mean the dying person and or the family members, suffer more than the people who believe there's something. Now, does that mean that it's all just made up to make us feel better? Depends. It depends on what they believe and where they got that information. But I would say to the teacher, we have bona fide scientific evidence of near-death experience that's been tested and proven in university studies and laboratories. And Mr. Teacher, Miss Teacher, whatever she was, I would suggest, after class I'll give you some, websites that you can look at, because how do you argue with that? How do you argue with some of these NDE stories that are impossible to make up, like the really famous one, I can't remember her name, where she flatlined in the ER or someplace and came resuscitated and reported seeing a red shoe. It's a very famous NDE story, the red shoe story, up on a windowsill of the hospital. And somebody checked it out and went up to the 21st floor or whatever, into some administrative office, and opened the window and looked out, and on one of the windowsills was a red shoe. You know how sometimes you see tennis shoes hanging over electric wires and telephone lines? Somehow there was a red shoe sitting up there. And, there was no way this woman had ever been in that office or had ever seen it. There's millions of stories like this. And, in fact, I was talking to Raymond Moody about this the other day, and we were saying, aren't you getting tired of hearing these stories? How many near-death experience stories have you heard? 10,000? How many are recorded and on record? 10,000, 20,000. What do we do with all this? I don't think we need to be convinced anymore because we have so much evidence. Now we have to kind of take it to the streets and do something with it. And I think that's what we're all doing in our work by having a show like this and the conference and all the different stuff we're doing.
Well, I love your idea of sending some resources to that teacher and just saying to her, you don't have to change your way of thinking. You can think what you think, but there is information out there that you might, to have a broad and diverse class, you might want to present this to your students even if you disagree with it. So
well, as an academic, she's sort of obliged to do that, isn't she?
She is,
Yeah, I mean, that's the research that's out there. It's in academic journals. It's the real deal. It's not a bunch of woo-woo stuff. It's true stuff.
And then because now we're talking about the afterlife, it brings us around to your conference. And so I'm so excited about your conference. I'd never heard of it before, but I see it as a great resource for listeners to this program, and I'm excited to be able to spread the word.
Well, thank you. So I started the conference I started conceptualizing it in 2010 because of the reasons we were talking about earlier, that I was seeing so many people suffering in their grief or their inability to cope with death in a calm, accepting way, I guess is a good way to put it, and especially the grieving parents. And there is a national organization for bereaved parents that they had a conference here in Portland several years ago, and I applied to go and give a talk there, and they very rudely turned me down and said, we don't accept any presentations that talk about the afterlife or signs from our loved ones or after-death communication or mediumship. We absolutely don't believe in that, and we don't allow it at our conference. So I started calling up people I knew in the field and saying, did you know about this organization and this ban on this material? And they said, oh, yeah, everybody knows about that. It was well known. And I said, well, we need to start our own conference where we can talk about this. And that's how it started. And I brought in a few well-known authors like Bill Guggenheim, who wrote Hello from Heaven, and Lou LeGrand, a very well-known grief counselor with several books, and several other people. And we started the first conference. And now, fast forward to the present, we're in our fourth year. This will be our fourth one in Portland, Oregon, June 5th through 8th. And we have Raymond Moody and Eben Alexander back. This is Raymond's third year with us and Eben's second. We've got the scientific research aspect of it. We've got Gary Schwartz from the University of Arizona, who's done really significant research on mediumship. And those are the science guys. And then we have some mediums who do gallery-style audience readings. We've got shamans who teach shamanic and native rituals for death and dying. And they're not native shamans. They're one's from Colorado, one's from Utah. They're just regular people, who've studied shamanism. And the techniques they teach are not really complicated or mystical or esoteric at all. They're very applicable to hospice work, just telepathic work you can do to help the soul release from the body, and rituals and really beautiful stuff. And then we have our spiritual teachers. We have somebody doing a seminar called The Other Side of Suicide. And my favorite topic, we have a panel discussion with hospice chaplains, theologians, anthropologists, called Heaven a History, subtitled Angels and Halos and Harps, oh my. And we're just talking about all these notions that people have of what happens when you die, and where do we get the idea, for instance, that people turn into angels when they die. A lot of people think that. And they say things like, well, my husband got his angel wings, and this is his 5-year angelversary. And that's also a kind of wishful thinking, infantile approach to grief. So we do a lot of looking at theological ideas and where they came from and how we can replace them with ideas that are a little bit more practical. And then we have a grief piece where we have a couple of different presentations on grief, but it's all, not the mainstream. We have somebody named Tom Zuba, who I think his book is called A New Way to Do Grief. So that's what the conference is, and it's all about a new way to do death.
It just sounds fascinating. You have such a diverse group of presenters, and it's appropriate for anyone, from someone working in hospice in any aspect. It could be nurse, volunteer, chaplain, home health aide, doctor,
Yeah, we've got all of those, and this year we even have CEUs for the first time for the shamanic practices for conscious dying workshop. And my goal is to be more in the mainstream. I don't need to take the conference to a spiritual mystical retreat in Sedona. I would rather have it be in San Francisco talking to a medical convention. You know what I mean? Because
yes.
the people meditating in Sedona, they already know this. I really want to reach out to the people who aren't sure or are curious, who really need to whom this is new information. And that is very, very much needed in clinical settings. And so I try to make it palatable to the mainstream and not too new age, because I want to attract those doctors and nurses and chaplains.
Yes, and I applaud you for that. I was recently talking to a nurse about that very fact, and she said that she's being drawn toward more fringe subjects in her work. But I said, if we're going to change the mainstream, we have to have a strong, firm foundation in the mainstream and mainstream science, and start from there. Because otherwise, we could all just stay out on the fringe, and we'll never have an impact on all the people who are really stuck in the mainstream and really hurting and longing for tools and longing for new ways of looking at death and dying, and they really need us to come and be their teachers.
Yes, and the fringe does fine all by itself. They don't really need to know that there's a soul that exists beyond the body, because they've known this for a long time. So, a lot of us started out in the fringe, and now we take that information and share it with the world, because, of course, there is no division between the fringe and the whatever. This needs to be in the mainstream. When I started doing hospital chaplaincy, which was about a year and a half ago, I had no idea, having never worked in a hospital before, how different death is treated in a hospital than it is in a hospice. I've been in hospices, inpatient hospice, for a few years, and I was really familiar with that. First time I ever saw a death in the ICU, I was mortified. I couldn't believe it. And I was training as a hospital chaplain. I was very inexperienced, and I was called to be with a family. And they had been told, we can't resuscitate Dad anymore. We're done. Just be with him, and he's going to die. But it's the ICU, and he's still plugged into everything, because legally they can't really do that. Even if they take him off the respirator, the lights are on, and there's machines blowing, and that bed thing that inflates that. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about? So
yes,
it's like an inflatable mattress that sort of pumps up and down.
to prevent bed sores. So.
Yeah, and that's on. And I would say to the nurses, can we just turn everything off? Can we turn off the lights? Can we turn off the bed thing? Can we turn off these things? And this is after the person's been taken off the respirator. And they say, no, we can't. We have to leave everything just like it is. Or I said, can we move him to the third floor into a regular room where it's quiet? No, we can't do that either. I was amazed. I had no idea it was like that.
Yeah. It's shocking, really, how far we have to go in the medical profession in order to really address death and dying.
Well, and then I started to learn, I would sit in on these care consultations as the chaplain if I was requested to be there. And you can see how the individual doctors bring in their own theology and their own beliefs to the patients. So we had a woman who was in ICU for 72 days. She was long past, being able to eat, and she was completely kept alive artificially. She could talk a little bit when she didn't have the respirator in, and I sat in on the care conference, and the family, they don't know anything, and they'd say to the doctor, well, what do you think we should do? And he'd say, well, we can keep her alive for a really long time, and if that's what you family members want, then we can do that. And he never suggested to the family that death was an option. And of course she died eventually after 72 days in ICU with everybody suffering, not to mention the financial cost and the emotional toll, just for the same result only 72 days later. So it's an extra 72 days of suffering for everybody. And I was amazed that this doctor didn't even mention hospice to them, because that was not his preference.
It's just so tragic for me to hear it, but I know that it's true because it's what I've seen over and over again in my own, through my own medical practice. And I will tell you, I'm taking it upon myself to be a messenger to other doctors, partly because doctors can't really hear this information from anyone else. They need to hear it from someone else in their own profession for it to seem credible and valid to them, because they assume, well, you're a chaplain, of course you see it that way. You're not a doctor. You have no, you wouldn't know how I see it. And so,
well, and then of course as a chaplain they think you're coming from religion.
Yes, of course.
They automatically think you're going to walk in with a Bible and a cross, and that's not how chaplaincy is anymore.
Yeah.
We have Buddhist chaplains and atheist chaplains. We have all kinds of chaplains. But that the doctors would never listen to a chaplain. And from what I've seen, and I'm still kind of green in the hospital setting because I haven't been doing this for very long, but what I have sensed socially is the doctors and the chaplains do not hang out together. They don't. I don't know any chaplains that have any sort of relationship with any of the doctors.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Well, I have been giving talks at medical conferences on what doctors need to know about death and dying, and what they need to know primarily is a lot of spiritual information about death and dying, but I would never state that right up front that that's what my talk will be about. And so I was at a conference last May, and my talk was billed as what's new in hospice. That's what they labeled my talk.
Yeah,
and
you snuck it in under the radar.
It was nothing that was actually new. It was. But I was terrified because I was in a room in front of 250 doctors, and it was at a scientific medical conference. So the presenter before me and the one after me both presented on research topics, and they had all the slides with bar graphs and data. I was just terrified, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? I was in a state of panic when I got up on the stage, and I just thought, okay, they're going to hate me, and I have to accept that, and I have to get through this somehow. So I gave the talk, and I couldn't feel very much warmth at all from the audience. I couldn't tell how they were reacting, but my husband was in the audience, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, there were people crying at my table while you were talking. And I said, wow. I was shocked. And then after the conference, when I was in the hallway in a more quiet area, I can't even tell you how many doctors came up to me privately. They never would have said anything in front of their peers, but they came up to me one-on-one and said, that's the best thing I ever heard. And one person said, this talk needs to be at every medical conference, in every specialty, everywhere. And so suddenly I realized they are listening and they do want to know this, but they can't even admit it in front of their peers. They can't even show that they're moved by it or that it's important to them. They could only tell me in private. So there's a huge amount of work to be done, but I'm taking it on my shoulders that because I am a doctor, that's why I'm here. That's why I ended up in this situation. I need to be the person on the inside who talks to doctors. So I'm working on it.
That's fantastic. You have to come and speak at our next conference in Virginia Beach. And,
I'd love to.
And, with you there, and your topic, we can market more to doctors and hopefully get more doctors to come because you are there. And we also have a doctor on our board, Joe O'Connell. He's an emergency doctor, and he's also been trained in Buddhism. So he's a very interesting combination of skills. And he's our biggest fan. And he, we hope, if this works, may be going on Dr. Oz soon, talking about his experience of the afterlife. So we need more of you guys to go out there in the mainstream. Eben Alexander really pushed through that, but the medical establishment just jumped up to debunk him immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And now they sort of see him as a fringe guy, even though he's a neurosurgeon, a medical school professor. I mean, his credentials are just stellar. But because he had an out-of-body experience while in a coma, the medical world sees him as laughable, which is really a shame.
Yeah, it definitely is.
And there's a lot of you good doctors out there. We just need to find them and bring them together and get them to speak.
Yeah, and we need to empower one another, I guess. For some reason, it is kind of intimidating when you go up against your peers and know that you're saying something that they all have trouble with. It's challenging to do, but
it happens even in the grief groups. When I talk to a grief group, I'll have that same feeling where they're just kind of looking at me blankly, and I think, okay, they're going to be throwing rotten tomatoes at me any minute. But sure enough, afterwards, same experience. They'll come up to me and they'll tell me that people were crying, and I'll get that feedback, but they keep it in the closet. And it's just like the people in our Facebook group. Some of them have fake Facebook identities because if their other friends and relatives on Facebook saw that they were posting these kinds of ideas and thoughts, they would get, a lot of crap from their friends and family.
Wow.
So there's a lot of closeting going on.
Yes, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. That helps me understand that it's really a societal problem. It isn't just medicine, but it's really where our society is with death and dying.
Yeah, and it's really interesting looking at the history of this, and you may know more about this than I do, but I've looked into, where the irrational fear of death came from in Western culture, and what I have learned, and maybe you know something new that I don't know, is that it really kind of started with the plagues, that prior to the plagues, we were a little bit more mystical about the process of death. I mean, hospice care was around back then. Mm-hmm. Priests would sit with the dying and do their rituals, the sacrament of the sick or the last rites or whatever they did, and they faced death. They would sit with the dying and actually help them cross over. And the theory that I heard is that once the plagues started to happen, the deaths were so physically gruesome and contagious and smelly and awful that nobody wanted to be around them. And it created this really scary imagery as well. And that's when, at least in Western culture, we started to really shy away from death. Does that resonate with you?
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
It's a question I ask myself all the time. Where did this come from?
Well, Terri, we're running out of time here, so I want to make sure you let our listeners know where they can get more information about the Afterlife Awareness Conference and how they could connect with you and learn more about you.
Well, the best way to do both of those things is to go to the website afterlifeconference.com and look around in there. If you're interested in the conference, click on the register link, and it will take you to even more information. And if you want to send an email, there's an email link there. It goes to info@afterlifeconference.com, which comes directly to me. And if anybody is interested in grief work, the new book can be found at griefstreet.com, and, of course, it's also on Amazon. So there's my shameless promotion for the hour.
Oh, Well, it's well deserved, and I'm promoting you as well. And I'm hopeful. I won't be able to attend this year's conference because I'm already signed up for a different conference at the very same time. And yours is June 5th through 8th, correct?
Yes.
In Portland.
Are you going to that? There's another death and dying conference on that same weekend. Is that the one you're going to?
No, I'm going to a little bit different conference. It's here in Colorado. It's called the Co-Creators Convergence, a spiritual conference. But so I'm disappointed that I'll miss it, but I'm hoping lots of listeners will sign up, and I want to hear everything about it, and I'm eager to stay in touch with you, Terri, and continue following your work.
Well, I would love to have you send me at some point just a very informal proposal about a talk that you would like to give at our 2015 conference in Virginia Beach about anything you want, but specifically, a doctor trying to break through the glass ceiling or whatever you want to call it, to break out of the closet in the hospital.
Out of the death and dying closet.
Out of the bringing death out of the closet in the hospital. Perfect.
Yes,
we really need that. So I really think that's where we're going next with all of this.
Yes. Oh, that's fantastic. Terri, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and sharing all this wisdom you have and energy, and I'm so impressed with your work, and I want to thank you for being who you are and for everything that you do.
Thank you, Karen. I'm so glad we found each other. I can't even remember how that happened, but I'm very grateful that it did.
Yes, same here. And I want to thank our listeners today for tuning in. Be sure and check out afterlifeconference.com and learn more about this amazing conference, and also get in touch with Terri Daniels and get a hold of her book, Turning the Corner on Grief Street. Remember that there are 2 new interviews every month on End of Life University. Refer your friends and colleagues who might enjoy listening to these interviews. And until the next time we hear from each other, take care and goodbye.